Question number 12. Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Education. Why is she proposing to flatten out the current funding rates across different year levels to a standard per-child amount as part of the Education Funding Review?
The Honourable Heke Parata.
Mr Speaker, I am not proposing to do that. If I could quote from the Cabinet minute that sets out what is to be tested, what has been agreed is that we look at the following proposal: a standard per child funding amount that would vary across stages of learning, reflecting the teaching and learning challenge in the curricula and the needs for children and young people, an additional payment for those children and young people most at risk of educational underachievement, and retaining supplementary funding to maintain a network of provision where small, isolated services and schools is an issue.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
Did she receive advice that the biggest driver of the different funding rates is currently the staffing ratios for each year level? If so, why is she putting forward a proposal to level out the base funding rates, given it will inevitably lead to some students being in much bigger classes?
The Honourable Heke Parata.
Mr Speaker, as I clearly explained, the proposal is not to flatten out the levels of funding.
Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
Did the Cabinet paper that she took to Cabinet propose changing the funding ratios for each year level to a standard formula?
The Honourable Heke Parata.
Mr Speaker, what I recommended was that we should base funding on the New Zealand curriculum Te Marutanga o Aotearoa, which has complexities and difficulties occurring along the 13 years of its delivery, and that we should match funding to those difficulties. It is clearly not a proposal to flatten out student funding.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
What changes to the current funding rates on a year-by-year basis did she propose in her Cabinet paper?
The Honourable Heke Parata.
I propose that they should be linked to the learning progressions of the New Zealand curriculum.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, Chris Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, I asked the Minister what changes she proposed to the funding rates on a year-by-year basis.
And the Minister answered that, as I heard, by saying it would be linked to a curriculum. Further supplementary?
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker. Can she guarantee that no secondary school students or primary school students in new entrant classes will end up in bigger classes, given they currently have the highest funding rates in the staffing funding formula?
The Honourable Heke Parata.
Mr Speaker, as I've already told the House, I don't propose to preempt the funding advisory group. I cannot guarantee that class sizes won't decrease.
Order. Order. We come now. Order. We come now to questions to members.